So now that we've discussed the concepts and the structure and functionality of Eureka and the API gateway, let's go ahead and take a look at how they're actually implemented in our project. So we'll take a look at the implementation of the Eureka and Gateway microservices in the QuoteServices app. The code, as we'll see, is almost entirely declarative, both for the gateway and for Eureka. And you can find this code, as always, in my GitHub repository. The particular code we're going to look at here is available in the EX4 project in the Web MVC folder in my Live Lessons GitHub repository. So we're now in the EX4 project in my Web MVC folder in my Live Lessons GitHub repository. And we're going to take a look at the source code for the gateway. And this will go by very quickly because there's not a whole lot to look at. So if you can see here, we've got several modules. We have the client module, the Eureka module, the gateway module, and the microservices module. And we're actually going to take a look at both the Eureka module and the gateway module because we've talked about those. So now we're going to take a look at the code. So let's come down here and look at Eureka first. And we're going to open up the Eureka application. And there it is. This is the Eureka application. You can see it looks very similar to all the other applications we looked at that define microservices in Spring. We have a class which we call Eureka application. It's going to say Spring application.run, passing in the class file, and then magic happens. And the magic in this particular case is the enable Eureka server annotation. And that just says make this a Eureka server. And that will involve this going over and looking at the application YAML file, which we already looked at before. And that defines the port number that this microservice is listening on, the name of it, Eureka. And then we'd say, don't register this thing with itself, because it's the Eureka microservice. And don't bother fetching the registry. But it also gives this default zone. And so it basically says, in effect, that use the host name here, which is localhost, and use the server port, which is that port, and make that be the zone in which this Eureka instance is going to control. It's the zone controller, if you will, in this context. So that's the Eureka implementation. Not a lot of code, right? Literally, it's just defining this kind of skeletal application and then saying it's a Eureka server and filling in the YAML file. The gateway implementation isn't a whole lot more than that. So it's got a little bit more, but not much more. So here is the gateway application. We can see this is a Spring Boot application. And we tell it to configure itself using annotations. And then we have some fun here. We go ahead and find ourselves a logger. We go ahead and look up the logger that we've got. And then we define something called gateway properties. And we auto-wire this. And because we want to use auto-wiring here, we use the @configuration annotation. And then the main program just has this run. This should look very familiar now. You've seen this many times. But there's one slight difference now. There's another method called init. And we use the post-construct annotation. And what that tells Spring is after you've instantiated this particular gateway application microservice, run this method. And what this method does is it goes and it takes a look at the properties that were auto-wired, and it's going to go ahead and log them. So it'll basically show all the routing paths that the gateway knows about based on the configuration it's been given. So when the gateway starts up, it's going to read all the configuration scripts we're about to look at, and then we're going to dump that to the output so we can see what it actually knows about. That's just there for debugging. And when we run the program later and we look at the output, you'll see how this works. The other piece of the puzzle here that's relevant is the resources package, which has the application YAML file that's used to say this is the gateway's port number, the name of the gateway. I'm not sure if this needs to be reactive. I'll figure that out later. But then it also says, I want this gateway application to be a Eureka client. So you enable Eureka client. It registers with Eureka. It fetches the registry, which just says, give me back a copy of what you know about, please. And then it tells it this is the default zone of the Eureka instance that's controlling this gateway. And we also set debugging to be debug so that when we print out those properties, we get some useful values. And then here's the application path YAML file. You can see that it's got some default filters here. It's got some cross-domain, cross-origin configuration flags that allow certain things to be enabled. This allows you to be able to have a web page that then can be used to access the back-end services. That's important for certain kinds of things, more for security-related reasons. And then down here, we have the list of routes. So these are ones we've looked at before. We tell it, hey, know about the handy microservice, which is found at this part of the URL. This is where you can find it if you want to forward to it. And please strip off the handy name when you forward that request. And we do something similar for the Zippy microservice. It's listening at a different port. It's got a different path, but we're going to strip the prefix off, and we're going to know about it. So that's how the gateway learns about the various pieces that it's going to have here. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the relative ease of developing a Eureka microservice and a gateway, an API gateway with Spring, because most of what you're writing are just these configuration files, and you can usually go and copy and paste them to find out what they need to do. And of course, if all else fails, you can ask ChatGPT what the meanings are of all these fields, and it'll tell you very quickly and concisely.